All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 9, Industrial Transformation in the North, 1800 to 1850. We'll be looking at Section 1, Early Industrialization in the Northeast. So one important thing to note is that the changes that we'll be talking about in this particular chapter mostly relate to economic changes, social changes. Remember, whenever you hear the word social, think society. That is how everyday people live. And also, to a certain degree, culture. Culture is more like the beliefs and attitudes in a specific society. So it's not so much political, but it's kind of changing the economy, changing society, and changing culture. Geographically, right, these changes are really only going to happen in the North, specifically here, the Northeast, which refers to New England. So that would be places like Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maine, that area. This industrial transformation is, it's only really happening in the North, although the impact of it does or is felt throughout the entire United States. So let's look at this term here, industrialization. So what is industrialization, or what is industrial transformation? Well, in short, it is the transformation from natural power sources to steam power. So we're talking about primarily power, or the engine which drives certain things, whether that is in terms of production or transportation. So the industrial process is going from using natural sources of power. That might be water. So for example, use something like a water wheel. It might be something like wind. But mostly it's human and animal power, right? So when you think about it, before industrialization, whether you were making something with your hands or whether you were getting from point A to point B, people, Homo sapiens, had always relied on natural sources of power. The process of industrialization, primarily thanks to the steam engine, which is the process of heating up water, creating steam, and then letting that pressure go. Now you have this transformation to machine power, right? So that is this transformation here from natural sources of power to machine power. That is fundamentally what is going on during the Industrial Revolution. Now that has an impact. So we'll think about this change taking place. That has an impact on the economy, that has an impact on society, and that eventually has an impact on culture. So we'll kind of go into more detail here about what that means. The first one, the way that people work. So before, when everything was handmade, it was created by artisans. Artisans are people who make things with their hands, right? And whatever it was, a good example is, using the examples of shoes. A shoe was made by an artisan, which essentially made that shoe with their hands. And that's how everything was essentially made before the Industrial Revolution. This process was a long and technical process. You had to know what you're doing. And so typically, an artisan would start off as an apprentice. That would be somebody who kind of sticks around the artisan and learns on the job. When they were ready to become more independent, an apprentice became a journeyman. And then once you were an expert at your craft, then you became an artisan. So it was this kind of lifelong learning process that took place. And again, remember, literacy is not very widespread. It's not like you can just simply read a book and learn how to put shoes together. That information was passed on typically from generation to generation to generation. In total, this amounted to very skilled work, right? It was a large investment, skilled work. Not a lot of people could do that. However, some of the system began to change a little bit. The putting out system, this allowed farm families, right? Farm families, unskilled, right? So these were not journeymen. These were not artisans who had spent their whole lives learning how to, perfect a certain craft. Farm families, typically unskilled, were able to, what we might say, maybe complete parts of the production. So maybe there was one part of putting the shoe together, like, I don't know, spinning the yarn into a shoelace, that you could essentially have an unskilled worker do. And that's what the putting out system did, is that it exported that work, certain tasks that were assigned to whatever it was that you were making, out to these unskilled farm families. They were paid a wage, right? So a wage is what workers are paid. And because it was unskilled work, that wage was typically much lower than what an artisan would cost, right? So an artisan, somebody who spent years and years and years learning how to do it, you would have to pay an artisan, say, like a Yelp review, $4, very expensive. Whereas when you employ the putting out system, because they're unskilled, you can maybe only pay them, maybe $2. So it cuts the costs. And textiles is cloth. So anything that's made out of cloth, your clothing, tablecloths, curtains, whatever it is, was one of the first industries to be profoundly affected by this. So you had a combination of certain parts of production being done by unskilled farm families, but when you had to create the finished product, the shoe, you still had to go to the artisan, right? But it was beginning to divide up labor. Now the big change comes with the rise of manufacturing. So this point that I had made previously, this right here, and I'm going to bring attention to it because it's important, right? The steam engine. The invention of this is huge, right? You could say that the invention of the steam engine perhaps had a larger impact on the history of human beings, that is Homo sapiens, more so than any other invention or discovery, arguably, maybe agriculture, but the steam engine was massively transformative. Great Britain was where the steam engine and the manufacturing or industrial system start. So Great Britain, we could call this the origin of industry. All right, that's where the very first steam engine had started, and some of the very first manufacturing facilities were created. Samuel Slater was I believe he was a British factory worker, but he brought British industry to the U.S. He's sometimes called the father of American industry. Because once you had this technology, right, once you had the technology of the steam engine, that was incredibly lucrative, and the British tried to protect that. They made it illegal to immigrate or to take that knowledge and export it elsewhere. They tried to protect it. Samuel Slater memorized the plans, came to the United States, and built the first water-powered cotton mill, and it proved to be incredibly successful. His style of a manufacturing or production system, so he's producing, you take the cotton and then you turn it into thread or textile or whatever it is. His system of manufacturing, or his factory system, was known as the Rhode Island system, which employed typically entire families, right? You had what they called a factory village. And typically it was the men who stayed home at the farm, they did the farming, the women and children then worked to the factories. They were relatively small scale, maybe about 70 workers per every factory. They were generally much more rural, out in the countryside. And they were some of the very first factory systems in the United States. They were in the Northeast, specifically in Rhode Island. Now, political events. Now, recall, this is going to bring us back to last chapter, chapter 8. The embargo by Thomas Jefferson and the War of 1812 severely limited overseas trade. And so a lot of that money that would have typically gone to trade instead went to domestic investment. So there was an increase in domestic investment, specifically in factories that produced textiles, and textiles were incredibly lucrative. Again, a textile is anything that is made out of cloth. So because of political events like the embargo, like the War of 1812, which cut off American trading overseas, merchants and people with money pretty much had nowhere else to invest except for into American factories. And the number of factories that were built in the United States grew pretty quickly in this particular period. Now, even though Samuel Slater and the Rhode Island system was maybe the first factory system, there was a factory system that proved more efficient, and that was created by, you can call it the Boston Associates, or you can call it the Boston Manufacturing Company. This was a group of investors who built factories that were a little bit more profitable, a little bit more efficient. What you could do with the factory system essentially was to centralize, right? Centralize production. Whereas before, this entire process, right, this putting out system, so whereas before maybe you took the cotton went to the farm family first, the farm family then created whatever thread was needed, then you sent it to the artisan, and the artisan made that. This whole process was bypassed, and instead, you can pretty much make the product from beginning to end at this factory system, and they're located in centralized areas. There's also a process in this factory system of de-skilling. In order to operate these machines, no skills required. Whereas it took before a lifetime of knowledge and know-how to make something like a shoe, anybody who could essentially pull a few levers or push a few buttons could essentially make a finished product. Instead of hiring farm families, so whereas the Rhode Island system employed entire families, this eventually gets called, in some cases, the Lowell system, or the Wolfman. But it becomes the predominant factory system. We'll just call it the factory system, right? As opposed to hiring entire families, instead individual workers were hired, which was much cheaper. And specifically in the most probably famous case of this was the Lowell mill girls in Massachusetts, who were young women who were required to live at the factory. They were required to follow strict rules, including no drinking, mandatory church attendance on Sunday. And one of the reasons why this particular factory system in Lowell, Massachusetts, only hired mill girls was to create a certain degree of respectability for that. Now, despite whatever system we're referring to, the Rhode Island system, the predominant factory system, one thing was true, and that was by using steam power, right? So think of it this way. Here we have a picture of one of these contraptions, right? These are the devices that would be used. This one is to mill flour, which means to grind up flour. Now, these sorts of apparatuses did exist, but before they were either hooked up to something like a very poorly drawn windmill, they were hooked up to maybe something like a water wheel, right? And again, here I'm just kind of having fun drawing these things. A water wheel that would, pour water, and as that water poured, it would spin, and as this was connected to this contraption, it would either weave, cloth into thread or whatever it was. Or sometimes you hooked up an animal to it, right? So let's draw a really bad animal here, right? You might hook up an animal to it, and that animal would sort of run around in a circle or whatever it was. But bottom line was that all of these things were natural sources of power, that if the wind didn't blow, if the water was frozen in the river, or if the animal died, then you weren't going to get any production. Now you change that, or you replace that essentially with a steam engine, and a steam engine was, again, very poorly drawn. You have your, you have your water sitting in here, right? That's where the water sits. You have your fire right here. Just keep throwing coal on the fire. And you put a lid on this, right? So many of you are probably familiar with something like a tea kettle or boiling water. But, when you boil water, it's going to create pressure. And then once you release this, or once you open it up, it's going to give you kind of this piston motion, and you hook that up to the machine. And that allows you essentially to produce 24/7 rain, shine, snow, etc., and it allows you to produce a lot more and more efficiently. And this increased output, essentially what you had as a result of this factory system emerging, was that one factory produced more textiles, more cloth than was ever produced in the year before, right? There was a dramatic increase of output, this also meant that prices dropped. So whereas before, when everything was handmade compared to factory made, not only is there a lot more, right, in the factory made, right? So you just have, way more, whereas you can barely produce something. It's also true that it's much cheaper. So the handmade stuff, again, with our Yelp review, is $4 signs, and the factory made is only $2 signs. And so this led to a rise of consumerism. Families that could never buy things before or had to make them themselves could now purchase things. This was an increase in material well-being, and this spread, this first happened in Great Britain, but also spread across the United States. Now, what came along with this as well was a change in the way that workers worked. I mean, there was a change in work. For one, there was a much stricter schedule. Whereas if you were somebody who made things with your hands, like an artisan, you could work whenever you want. You worked, sort of in accordance with the natural world. Now things were very strict. You could be late for work. You worked by the factory whistle, right? So you don't get to decide when you get to work. You decide when the factory whistle blows, right? For example, time and clocks became much more important and integral in a person's life. You don't just wake up when the sun comes up, but you have to wake up when you have to go to work. Whereas people worked outdoors before, now it was strictly indoors. The tasks were very, very repetitive, right? Think about it. Making something with your hands, you have that process from beginning to end. Whereas when you're in a factory system, the machine does all the work. You might just push a button or pull a lever over and over and over and over and over again. And that's very repetitive and has a certain psychological, right, impact. Before you could be proud of your work. You're invested in it. Now that is, that's gone, and it has a huge psychological impact on the population. It was dangerous, right? You think about fires, textiles, plus flame lighting, right? No light bulbs, so a lot of fires broke out. A lot of injuries. The machines were very dangerous. They could remove limbs, get your finger cut off, whatever it was. And abuse, right? There was strict punishment and discipline. That's probably the word I'm looking for. Strict discipline, including a lot of child labor. You could pay a child a lot less. Remember, why hire children? Well, it's because the job now doesn't really require any type of skills, right? Let's go back up to this point about this industrial process being de-skilling, right? Who can pull a lever or push a button? Well, anybody can do that, including children. And children, you could pay them the least amount of money out of anybody. So child labor was very rampant, right? We're going to give them a $1 sign Yelp review. You don't have to pay them anything. And so this led to new problems, right? New problems. Oops. For workers that they really had never had before. And in an effort to combat that, workers, or the labor movement, sought to improve conditions. All right, the labor movement is workers organizing to, and then we'll just point right back up here, to improve conditions, right? So workers now have kind of this common shared experience. On the one hand, it is true, workers are being paid. The factory work was very attractive for farm families who could go into a city, right, where one of these factories existed, who could earn money. There was a certain sense of freedom, especially freedom from things like your family or rural life, right? Life on the farm wasn't all that great either. But the trade-off was long hours, discipline, and low wages. And this led workers to go on strike, which is refusal to work, including the Lowell Mill girls who also went on strike. So you see some young women here. They worked in the early industrial factories. Now, one of the ideas that was embraced by the proponents of the labor movement, and this sort of gets at some of the distribution of wealth in an industrial society, was the labor theory of value. And that essentially is the theory that workers be paid for the value they create, right? Workers be paid for the value they create. So in this industrial system, on the one hand, you have your industrialist. We'll put a top hat on him. You know, he is wealthy, he is affluent, he owns the factory, right? There's the factory, there's the smokestack, right? So they own this, right? Then you have the workers on the other hand. And these two things together, I'll scroll down here so we can see. Right, these two together create a product, right? They create a shirt, right? That shirt sells for a certain amount of money, right? Let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what labor theory of value states is that for whatever value that the workers put in, right? Let's say that they put in $3 worth of work and the business owner puts in $2 worth of work. Well, then that ought to be divided, or that ought to be splitted up fairly, right? That the workers should get that much back and that the business owner should get that much back. But in reality, of course, it didn't work that way. In reality, workers were able to be exploited for the cheapest possible wages. So they might put $3 worth of work in, but only get $1 worth of work out, whereas the factory owners kept the majority of the money. And this led to an increase in the what we might call income, even though it's not really income. Let's not use income. We'll say wealth. Wealth inequality, right? So it's true that both the factory owners and the workers are increasing their wealth. They have more money than they did before, and that's mostly because this system, by working together, creates more wealth. However, the difference in wealth between those who are rich and those who make up the labor class, that grows bigger, right? So that refers to wealth inequality. And so in order to organize and fight back, there were different organizations that were created by workers. The Working Men's Party, created by Thomas Skidmore. He is the founder of the Working Men's Party. And he proposed kind of some more radical ideas to help solve the problems that workers had. He proposed redistribution of property and a form of radical equality between women, men, and different racial categories, right? And that would be a way of helping to solve this problem of wealth inequality. Now, for the most part, many of the early workers were domestic. Domestic is from the United States. They were typically from farm families. But increasingly, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, immigrants began to replace domestic born, or those people born in the United States, as the primary workforce. And that was because immigrants were willing to work for less, right? And this is especially true in regards to Germany and Ireland. So it wasn't uncommon at all in American cities to find many foreign workers, right, or immigrant workers who begin to make increasingly a larger proportion of the workforce.